Harrow Falls, Colorado Territory, June 1883. The kind of town that looked smaller every year, not because people left, but because the ones who stayed had a way of filling every available inch of space with their opinions about everyone else. Nora Callum had lived inside those opinions for 24 years. She didn't think about that on the 11th night. She thought about thread tension and border alignment and whether the indigo would hold its color through a hard wash. She thought about the angle of the lamplight and whether she was straining her eyes and whether it mattered if she was. She thought about everything except sleep, because sleep required stopping and stopping required being finished, and she wasn't finished yet. 11 nights. The quilt had started as something practical. That was what she told herself when she cut the first square from her mother's burgundy Sunday dress, the one Frances Callum had worn to every Easter service for 20 years, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where it had been folded since the funeral. Practical, a use for good fabric that would otherwise sit in a box until the moths found it. But the thing about making something with your hands, really making it, is that your hands know things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. And Nora's hands, broad and capable and roughened from 2 years of running a ranch alone, knew exactly what they were doing, even when she didn't. The center square was black cotton cut from her grandmother Hattie's house dress. Hattie Callum had worn that dress for the last 8 years of her life, through 2 hard winters and a drought and the kind of quiet grief that settles into a person after they've outlived most of the people they loved. The fabric had gone soft from wearing the particular softness that didn't come from washing, but from time, from being part of a body that moved through the world day after day until the cloth learned the shape of the person inside it. Nora placed it at the center. Around it, she built the burgundy ring at her mother's color, the deep, warm red that Frances had loved, and that Nora associated with Sunday mornings, and the smell of biscuits, and the sound of her mother humming something without words while she pinned her hair. Around the burgundy, she placed the indigo deep blue-black cut from 3 different weights of fabric because she hadn't had a large enough single piece. And threading through all of it, connecting the rings like light between heavier things, the yellow calico she'd bought in April from the bolt at Henderson's general store, not because she'd needed it for anything specific, but because something about the small white flowers on yellow ground had looked in the moment she'd seen it like the kind of thing that should exist in the world. She tied off the last stitch she'd attempt that night somewhere past 2 in the morning. She didn't sleep well. She rarely did anymore. By 5, she was up. And by 6, she had the quilt rolled and tied with twine and tucked under her arm, and she was walking the 3/4 mile of packed dirt road that connected her father's ranch to the edge of Harrow Falls. The morning was cool and the sky was doing something complicated with its colors, and she didn't look at it because she was watching the road. She'd learned that beautiful mornings in this part of Colorado had nothing to do with how the day was going to treat you. The town was already stirring when she arrived. Smoke from the bakery on the corner, the sound of the feed supply being opened, a dog crossing the main street with the unhurried confidence of a creature that understood its territory. Nora walked past all of it and pushed open the door of Dorothea Holt's Dry Goods at 4 minutes past 9. Dorothea Holt had been running the Thursday sewing circle out of the back room of her shop for 11 years. Technically, the circle was open to any woman in the county. Technically. In practice, it was a room organized around a set of standards that Dorothea had never written down because she hadn't needed to. Everyone understood them. The women who fit them sat at the table without being asked. The women who didn't stood at the door a moment too long. Nora pushed through the door anyway. 7 women, long table quilting frames, fabric baskets, 2 already threading needles without looking up. Dorothea Holt stood at the far end with a coffee cup she did not offer to share. She was a handsome woman of 52, sharp-featured, always dressed as though she expected to be seen by someone who mattered. She had run this town's social life the way a foreman ran a crew efficiently and without sentiment, and she had been doing it for so long that most people had stopped noticing it was happening. "Nora," she said, not a greeting, an acknowledgement the kind you gave a cat that had wandered in from the street. "Morning," Nora said. She moved to the one empty chair, set her rolled quilt on the edge of the table, and began unwrapping the twine. The room held its rhythm for about 30 seconds. Then Winifred Cass looked over. Winifred Cass had a thin face and a gift for precision cruelty wrapped in the careful language of social concern. She was Dorothea's nearest ally and her most reliable instrument, the kind of woman who delivered other people's verdicts so efficiently that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. She tilted her head the way she always did when she was preparing to say something she'd already decided. "What is that?" "A quilt," Nora said. She pulled back the last of the wrapping and spread the piece across her end of the table. Burgundy and cream and deep indigo with the yellow calico threading through the seams. The pattern was a modified log cabin, each section anchored on the small dark square of black at its center. It wasn't perfect. The borders ran slightly uneven on the east side, and one section of stitching had a row that was a fraction loose at the corner. But the color arrangement was something else. Something that moved, that had a visual weight the way a good piece of music has weight even when it's quiet. Winifred stared at it. Then she laughed. Small and controlled, aimed at the woman beside her, a younger circle member named Constance, who covered her mouth and looked away. A signal passing between them like smoke through a cracked window. Dorothea set her coffee cup down. "That's quite the combination of fabrics." "Thank you," Nora said. She had decided years ago to accept compliments that weren't intended as compliments. "I wasn't—" Dorothea stopped adjusted. "The indigo doesn't suit the burgundy. That's all I meant." "They don't have to suit," Nora said. "They just have to hold." A silence with a shape to it. Winifred folded her hands on top of her own work, every square cut with a ruler aligned to within a thread's width of perfection. "I suppose if you can't manage technique, you can always call it intention." The laughter was open this time, not bothering to hide. Nora did not look up from the border she was working. Her hand was steady. She had trained it to be steady a long time ago, the same way she had trained her face and her voice, because the alternative was giving Winifred Cass exactly what Winifred Cass was waiting for. She worked for an hour. The conversation moved around her like water around a stone. Deliberate practiced exclusion requiring maintenance. They discussed a wedding. They discussed the new pastor's wife. They discussed a woman in the next county who had won a prize at a fair, and this was analyzed with the specific intensity women reserve for the accomplishments of people they don't know and therefore cannot diminish by proximity. Not one of them spoke to Nora. She didn't expect them to. She was used to this particular silence. It had its own weight, its own texture, and she had learned to work inside it without letting it press her down. At 10:15, she rolled her quilt, tied the twine, and stood. "Leaving early?" Dorothea asked. Mild, careful. "Finished what I came to do," Nora said. She walked through the shop and out onto the main street of Harrow Falls, where the June sun came down like something physical, and she was 3 steps down the boardwalk when she heard them. Not Winifred this time. A group of men sitting outside the feed supply, 4 of them, the kind of men who had no particular place to be at 10 in the morning and were comfortable with that fact. Otto Driscoll was among them, a broad-faced man who worked at the tannery and who had a talent for cruelty that cost him nothing because it was aimed at people he had decided didn't count. He'd seen her come out of the dry goods. "Monroe girl," he said not quietly, "carrying her pretty little blanket." Laughter. The specific lazy kind that costs the people doing it nothing and lands on the person it's aimed at like a flat stone dropped from a height. Nora kept walking. She reached the end of the boardwalk where it ended, and the packed dirt street began, stepped down, and her boot caught the uneven edge of the last plank. She had caught it a dozen times before without trouble. Today, with the quilt under her arm, and 11 nights of lost sleep, and an hour of being invisible in a room full of women who could see her perfectly well, she went down, not a small stumble. A full graceless fall. One knee hitting dirt, one hand coming down hard, the quilt tumbling free of her arm and unrolling itself across the street in the dust as though it was demonstrating something. The laughter behind her doubled. She heard it from the feed supply. She heard it from somewhere across the street. She heard a woman's voice from the direction of the dry goods say something she couldn't make out. And then that woman laughed, too. Nora stayed where she was for a long second, one hand flat in the dirt. She looked at her quilt, the indigo and the burgundy and her grandmother's house dress, now spread in the street with a streak of dust running through the center of it. Something in her chest cracked the way it hadn't cracked in years. She reached for it. "Allow me." The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, not performing concern, just stating an intention. She looked up. He was already crouching, gathering the edge of the quilt with both hands. He wasn't rough with it. He took it the way you take something that matters, pinching the edge clean and rolling it back toward itself with a kind of automatic care that said he'd handled things requiring careful handling before. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, dark shirt trail dust on his jacket and the brim of his hat and the tops of his boots. A face that had been in the sun a long time. No softness in it, but no cruelty either. He looked like a man somewhere past 30 maybe by a few years, with eyes the color of river water in October. He was paying attention to the quilt the way most people in Harrow Falls had never once paid attention to anything Nora Callum had made. He finished rolling it, tied the loose end of the twine she'd dropped, stood up and held it out to her. She was on her feet by then. Her knee hurt. Her palm had dirt ground into it. She took the quilt with both hands and did not thank him immediately because she hadn't gotten her voice organized yet. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. It came out steadier than she'd expected. "That's a good piece of work," he said. He said it the way you say something that is simply true. No flourish, no angle on it. Nora looked at him. "You saw it for about 4 seconds. I've bought horses in less time than that." He touched the brim of his hat. "Reed Danner." "Nora Callum." She tucked the quilt back under her arm. "You're passing through." It wasn't a question. She'd learned to read the men who were passing through versus the men who were planted here, and this man had nothing planted about him. "Cattle run," he said. "Coming through from Benson, heading to Ridgeway. I water the horses in Glenwood on the far end of the run before turning back." "Well." She looked at him, still trying to find the angle, because in her experience, men who picked things up for you always wanted something back for it. "Thank you for picking that up. Seemed worth picking up," he said simply. Then he looked past her just for a moment at the group of men outside the feed supply who had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when something happens that they didn't script. His expression didn't change. He looked back at Nora. Across the street, Edna Birch stood in the doorway of Henderson's General Store. She was a small woman of 50 with a gray-streaked braid, and she'd been standing there long enough to have heard most of it. She was saying something to the woman beside her, quiet, not meant to carry, but the street was suddenly very quiet, and it did carry that piece of work, was the most interesting thing this county had produced in 5 years. Nora didn't look at Edna. She was watching Reed. He had heard it too. She could see that in the slight stillness that moved through him, the way a person goes still when they've taken in something they didn't expect. He didn't let on. He just looked back at Nora with those October River eyes and waited to see if she needed anything else. She didn't. "Good day to you, Miss Callum," he said. He walked back toward the hitching post, where a dark horse stood patiently. He checked the cinch, loosened the reins, and didn't look back. Nora stood in the street holding her quilt and watched him go. Behind her, Otto Driscoll said nothing. For once in his life, Otto Driscoll said absolutely nothing at all. She didn't think about Reed Danner again that day. She thought about her quilt and whether the dust would set into the indigo permanently or wash out clean. She thought about the weight of Dorothea Holt's silence. She thought about Winifred Cass's laugh, which had the precise shape of a correction aimed at something that hadn't asked to be corrected. She washed the quilt that afternoon in the basin behind the house, wringing it by hand, the water running gray, and then pale, and then clear. She hung it on the fence line and watched the wind move through it. Every stitch held. The next morning, she was at her work table mending a split seam on a man's work jacket, the kind of small job that paid in coins rather than dollars, when she heard a horse in her yard. She went to the door. Reed Danner sat on his dark horse at the edge of her fence. He had his hat in his hand, which she hadn't expected. He was looking at the quilt, still hanging on the fence line, reading it the way she'd noticed him reading it in the street, with the attention of someone actually taking something in, rather than looking to have an opinion confirmed. "Mr. Danner," she said. He looked over. "Miss Callum." He put his hat back on. "I apologize for coming without notice. I'm heading out this morning, but I wanted to ask you something first." She came to the edge of the porch. "Ask." He nodded toward the fence, toward the quilt, toward the black center squares. "The fabric at the center. What is it cut from?" She considered not answering. It was none of his business what her quilt was cut from, but there was something in the way he asked level, like he wasn't making conversation, like he actually needed the information that made the refusal feel wrong. "My grandmother's house dress," she said. "Black cotton. It was the only dress she owned for the last 8 years of her life." He was quiet for a moment. "Why'd you put it in the center?" "Because that's where the things that hold everything else together go," Nora said. "That's how the pattern works. The center anchor determines the whole structure. You build everything else out from what doesn't move." Another silence, a different quality. Something settling in it. "That's a fine answer," he said. He picked up his reins. She was going to let him go. She had already decided to let him go. Then she heard herself say, "You're leaving today." "Cattle don't wait." "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose they do." He rode out through her gate and left it unlatched behind him, which annoyed her because she always latched her gate, but she latched it herself and went back inside and told herself she had already stopped thinking about him before she'd reached her work table. She had not stopped thinking about him. He came back 4 days later. She was in the side yard, standing in the sun between tasks, something she rarely permitted herself when she heard the horse, and looked up. He was at her gate, and this time something was draped across his saddle. A bundle of fabric, 3 or 4 pieces folded together, worn at their edges, some faded. He dismounted, opened the gate himself, latched it behind him, and walked the horse in. He lifted the bundle off the saddle and held it out. "Cloth scraps," he said. "From various places. I pick them up when I see them. I don't know exactly why. Thought maybe they'd be of use to you." She took the bundle and unfolded the top piece. A faded green wool, old and soft from years of use. The kind of softness that came not from regular washing, but from being held, from being carried close to a body for a long time. She turned it over. There was stitching on one edge that hadn't been hers. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "Montana," he said. She looked up at him. He said nothing else. Stood there with his hat on, and his expression even waiting to see what she would do with the information. "Montana's a long way," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She folded the green wool carefully. "I'll make good use of these." "I reckon you will." He touched his hat. "I won't take up your time." "You're not taking up my time," she said, and felt the words land oddly between them, like she'd said something more than she'd intended. "I mean, you don't have to rush off." He looked at her for a moment, assessing something without being rude about it. "I'll be through again in about a week," he said, "if you'd have more use for company than not." "I don't know yet," Nora said honestly. The corner of his mouth moved. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one close enough to read if you were paying attention. "Fair enough," he said. He mounted up, tipped his hat, and rode out. This time he latched the gate behind him. She stood in her yard, holding a bundle of old cloth that had come from Montana, and tried to figure out what she was feeling. Curiosity, mostly, but something underneath it that she didn't have a good name for yet, something that lived below the level of words. He came back in 6 days, not 7. She noticed, but didn't mention it. He brought 2 more fabric scraps, a piece of rust-colored linen, and something that had once been white, but was now a deep cream from age. He sat on the fence rail while she examined them, which she found unusual, but didn't object to. He wasn't chatty. He answered questions when she asked them, and otherwise stayed quiet, which she appreciated, because most people who visited and stayed for any time felt compelled to fill every silence, and they filled it badly. "You said you make runs between Benson and Ridgeway," she said, holding the cream fabric up to the light. "How many times a year?" 6, sometimes 8, depends on the season. "And you've been doing this how long?" 3 years. "So you've ridden this route before?" "Yes." "But you never stopped in Harrow Falls before?" A pause. "No," he said. "I hadn't." She looked over at him. He was looking out at the flat stretch of land beyond her fence line. "Why now?" she asked. He took a long moment with that question. "Sometimes something catches your eye," he said, "and you can either keep riding or you can stop." He paused. I stopped. "What caught your eye?" He turned his head and looked at her directly. "You," she held very still. "Not," he said, and stopped and seemed to choose his next words with some care. "Not in the way men usually mean when they say that." He looked back at the fence line. "I saw you come out of that store with something you'd made, and I saw the way those people looked at you, and I saw the way you looked back, like you'd decided something a long time ago about what you were willing to carry. I recognized that." Nora put the cream fabric down on her lap. "Recognized it from where?" she asked quietly. He looked out at the land, a long, flat silence with texture in it. "Different place," he said finally. "Same weight." She didn't push. She'd learned when to push and when to let a silence be what it was, and this one needed to be left alone. "The rust linen might work for a border piece," she said, picking it back up. "It's got structure to it." "Good," he said. And they sat there, him on the fence rail and her on the porch step, in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, while the June light moved across the yard and the afternoon went on around them, patient and indifferent the way afternoons were. The following Thursday, Nora went back to the sewing circle. She'd spent 2 days arguing herself out of going itemizing all the reasons she had better uses for her time and her dignity than sitting in Dorothea Holt's back room, being managed with professional precision. She went anyway, because she had made a promise to herself a long time ago that she would not let other people's bad behavior narrow the geography of her life. And she had kept that promise even when keeping it cost her something. She set her current work on the table, a smaller piece than the log cabin quilt, a running pattern in the rust linen Reed had brought. Winifred Cass looked at it immediately. "New piece?" "Yes." "Where'd you get that linen? I haven't seen that color at Henderson's." "I didn't get it from Henderson's." Winifred's eyes sharpened. "Where then? Someone brought it by?" Nora threaded her needle with more attention than it required. "A cattleman passing through. He had some fabric scraps he thought I could use." The room's rhythm changed, small and subtle, but Nora had been reading these rooms long enough to feel the shift. "Someone," Winifred repeated. "Who?" "A Mr. Danner," Nora said. "He stopped by my place. He had some scraps he thought I could use." "He stopped by your place," Dorothea said. "That's what I said." "Alone." Nora looked up. She met Dorothea's eyes across the table and kept her own flat and unimpressed. "Yes, Dorothea. Alone. In the yard. In full daylight. Is there something you'd like to ask me directly, because I'm finding the sideways version a little tedious?" Helen Pruitt, sitting near the end of the table, made a small surprised sound. Winifred set her needle down. "We're just concerned for your reputation, Nora." Dorothea's voice was carefully measured. "A man coming to a woman's property, unaccompanied. People talk." "People talk regardless," Nora said. "That's never stopped before, and a cattle run through town isn't going to change it." "A young woman alone has to be careful," Dorothea said. "Especially one in your—" She stopped. "Chose something. Your situation." "My situation," Nora said. "Living alone. No family here. No—" Another stop. "I know what you mean," Nora said. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd say the rest of that sentence out loud, rather than making me fill in the words you're too polite to say to my face." The room was very quiet. Dorothea picked up her scissors again. "I'm only saying what any decent woman would say." "Then I suppose we'll have to disagree about what decent women say," Nora replied, and went back to her stitching and did not look up again for the remainder of the hour. She left when her piece reached a natural stopping point. Not early, not rushed. She rolled it up, nodded to the room in general, and walked out. Halfway down the street, she realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the specific physical toll of holding yourself absolutely steady when every nerve in your body is vibrating. She pressed one hand flat against her side until the shaking stopped. Then she kept walking. Behind the closed door of Dorothea Holt's dry goods, she heard the conversation start up like a fire that had been waiting for air. She was nearly to the edge of town when she heard a low, careful voice. "Miss Callum." She turned. Edna Birch was standing in the doorway of Henderson's, holding herself in the particular way of someone who has been carrying a decision long enough that the weight of it has become urgent. "I heard something today," Edna said, coming a step closer and lowering her voice. "At the counter while Dorothea was buying ribbon this morning." She glanced behind her, then back. She was talking to Clifford Pike. Clifford Pike was the county land agent. He was also the man who had offered to buy Nora's ranch 2 years ago at roughly a third of its value, on the grounds that it was too much for a woman alone to manage. He had not been gracious about her refusal. "About what?" Nora asked. "About you," Edna said. "About your land." She pressed her hands together. "She said she has a document. Something about a debt your father left unresolved. She's moving quickly, Nora. I thought you should know." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Edna Birch, who had stood at that counter for years and said very little about anything, was standing in a doorway telling her this, and the telling of it had cost her something visible. "Thank you, Edna," Nora said. "I'm not asking for your gratitude," Edna said. "I'm just telling you what's true." Nora walked the 3/4 mile back to her ranch in the afternoon light, and she did not look at the sky, and she did not think about Reed Danner or the green wool from Montana or the expression that lived at the corner of his mouth. She thought about her father's papers. She thought about what was in the chest at the bottom of the wardrobe in his room, the room she hadn't changed because she hadn't been able to. The room that still smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco that faded a little more every season. She let herself into the house, walked past her work table, and went directly to that room. She pulled the chest out from under the wardrobe. She lifted the lid. Deeds. Tax receipts. A letter from a neighboring rancher dated 1862. Her parents' marriage certificate creased soft as old cloth. 3 receipts from a hardware man in the county seat, and beneath all of it a document she didn't immediately recognize. She lifted it out and read it twice. A promissory note, dated 1879. Her father, Thomas Callum, had borrowed $40 from a man named Croft, secured against the property. She turned it over. On the back, in her father's handwriting, faded but legible, the careful, deliberate script of a man who had taken seriously the weight of written words. Paid in full. March 18th, 1879. Witnessed by J. Slade. And beneath that, a second signature, Reverend Jonathan Slade, who had been the pastor of the Harrow Falls Methodist Church for 31 years. Nora sat on the floor of her father's room with the document in her hands and felt the shape of what Dorothea Holt had done. A copy. The woman had a copy of this note, just the front side, just the debt, without the record of repayment, and she had held it for however long she'd had it, and she had chosen this moment to bring it out. This moment with Reed Danner coming to Nora's gate and people beginning to look at Nora differently. Nora sat with that for a long moment. Then she folded the note carefully the way you fold something that matters, and held it against her chest. Outside, the evening light was going long and gold over the ranch land her father had built with 30 years of work, and the fence line she'd repaired herself last October, and the garden plot she'd turned alone in April, and the quilt still hanging on the fence that had 11 nights of lost sleep in it, and a dirt mark across the center that had almost but not quite washed out. She sat on the floor of her father's room until the light was gone. Then she stood up, went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and thought about what needed to happen next, and in what order. Underneath the cold weight of what she now understood, something that was not quite anger and not quite certainty, but was something structural between the two. Something that didn't bend. Dorothea Holt had been holding that document for 2 years. She had been waiting for a reason to use it. What Dorothea had not counted on was that Thomas Callum had been a careful man. A man who wrote things down. A man who understood that the only protection against someone else's version of events was your own clear record of the truth. The debt had been paid. March 18th, 1879. Witnessed by a man who had been in this county for 31 years and who had whatever else he was never once been called a liar. She would go to Reverend Slade in the morning. She would bring Edna Birch with her. And then she would go to Clifford Pike's office and place this document on his desk and not leave until the matter was settled. The kettle came to a boil. She poured the water and sat down at her table in the lamplight and held her cup in both hands and did not feel afraid. She felt like a woman who had been waiting for this particular fight for long enough that she was almost glad it had finally arrived. Outside, the Colorado night settled over Harrow Falls. The quilt on the fence moved slightly in the evening wind, the indigo and the burgundy and the dark center that didn't move, that held everything else in place. Tomorrow, she would fight for what was hers. She had been fighting her whole life in smaller ways. This would just be the largest version of something she already knew how to do. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. For the first time in weeks, she slept without waking. She was at Reverend Slade's door by 7 in the morning. Edna Birch was already there, standing on the step with her hands folded and her gray braid pinned up against the early chill, looking like a woman who had made a decision in the night and was not going to unmake it in the daylight. She had brought nothing with her except herself, which Nora was beginning to understand was the most substantial thing Edna Birch had to offer. "I figured you'd come early," Edna said. "I figured you'd be here," Nora replied. They didn't say anything else. They knocked. Reverend Jonathan Slade was a man of 63 who had the particular quality of someone who had listened to human beings at their worst and their most desperate for 3 decades, and had come out the other side not cynical but careful. He was careful with his words. He was careful with his silences. He had been managed by Dorothea Holt in the way that decent men sometimes get managed by forceful ones, not through dishonesty but through the gradual narrowing of what questions he thought to ask. And he had lived inside that arrangement long enough that he'd stopped noticing the walls of it. He opened the door, looked at the 2 women on his step, and understood immediately that something had shifted. "Miss Callum," he said. "Edna, come in." His study smelled of books and old wood and the mustiness of papers that had been handled many times over many years. He sat behind his desk. They sat across from him. Nora placed the promissory note on the desk between them. He looked at it for a long time. He read the front. He read the back. He looked at his own signature, the one he'd put there on March 18th, 1879, in the careful hand of a man who understood the weight of bearing witness. "I remember this," he said. "Then you remember the debt was cleared," Nora said. "Not a question. I do." He looked up at her directly. "Your father paid every cent. Croft asked me to witness it because he wanted a record that couldn't be disputed. Your father asked me to witness it for the same reason." He set the document down. "Where did you find this?" "My father's chest, in his room." Slade was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dorothea Holt came to see me 2 days ago. He said it the way you say something that requires honesty about your own part in it. She told me there was an outstanding lien on your property, a debt your father left unresolved." He paused. "She had a document." "A copy," Nora said. "A copy," he confirmed. "Just the front side." The room was quiet. Edna, who had not spoken since they'd sat down, made a sound that wasn't a word, but communicated everything that needed to be communicated. "She didn't show you the back," Nora said. "She did not." Slade's jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen on him before, the honest man underneath the managed man, present and operational when you pressed the right point. He looked at the document, then he looked at Nora. "I'll write a statement, whatever form it needs to take to be official. And come with us to Pike's office," Nora said. A pause. Then, "Yes." He said it without hesitation, which told her the hesitation had already happened privately in the night and he had worked through it. "I'll come with you." He wrote the statement in 20 minutes. His handwriting was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had been putting important things into words for a long time and had learned that the words only worked if they were exact. He signed it. He folded it. He handed it to Nora. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that has weight beyond its physical mass. "This isn't the kind of thing I'm willing to let pass quietly," Slade said. He was already reaching for his coat. "Thank you," Nora said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Your father was an honest man who kept his word. The least I can do is keep mine." They went to Clifford Pike's office at 8:30. Pike was a man of 50 with a land agent's particular combination of careful friendliness and cold calculation. He looked up from his papers when the three of them walked in, and something moved across his face, a brief recalibration, the expression of a man who had arranged a particular kind of morning and was now looking at a different morning entirely. "Miss Callum," he said. "Reverend Slade." "Edna." Nora placed the promissory note on his desk. "You've been presented with a copy of this document," she said. "I'm presenting you with the original." He picked it up, read the front. She watched his eyes move to the back. He read her father's handwriting. He read Reverend Slade's signature. He set the document down. "A statement," Nora said, and placed Slade's folded paper beside the note. Pike opened it, read it through once, then again. He set it down. He looked at Nora across his desk with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it and is now calculating how to absorb the loss without visibly bleeding. "The matter is resolved," he said. "Yes," Nora said. "It is." She picked up both documents, folded them, and put them inside her coat. She stood. Slade and Edna stood with her. She looked at Pike for one moment, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the level gaze of a woman who is done being underestimated by this particular man in this particular office. Then she walked out. The morning sun hit her on the front step, and she stood there for a full minute, just breathing. Edna came to stand beside her. Slade stood slightly behind them, giving them room. The street of Harrow Falls went about its business around them. Horses, wagons, the smell of the bakery 2 doors down, the ordinary sounds of a town that had no idea what had just happened inside that office. "Well," Edna said. "Yes," Nora said. She walked home. The road felt different that morning. She noticed her own feet on the packed dirt in a way she didn't usually notice them, the solid contact of boot on ground, the weight of her own body moving through space. She had been walking this road for 2 years with her head down, watching for the uneven places, managing her footing. This morning she walked it with her head level. She didn't see Reed Danner that day. He came the day after in the afternoon with a particular unhurried directness that had started to feel familiar in a way she hadn't anticipated. He came through the gate, latched it, and walked up to the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him stay where he was for a moment. "Something happened," he said. She told him. Not the shape of it, but the inside of it. Dorothea and the document, the 2 years of waiting, the copy without the repayment notation, the way it had been timed with precision. She told him about Slade's statement and Pike's office and the moment she'd placed the original on the desk. He listened all the way through without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a count of 10. "She's had that document for 2 years, he said. "At least 2 years, Nora said. She was holding it, waiting for something she could connect it to. She looked at him steadily. "Something that would make people feel like I deserved it." He understood what she meant. She watched him understand it, watched the thing move across his face, controlled but real. "Me," he said. "You," she said. "Not because you did anything wrong, because she could make it look like a pattern. Woman with poor judgment, man with no roots, property that was always a little too independent for Dorothea Holt's comfort." She paused. She needed the story before she needed the document. Once she had the story, the document was the ending. He stood very still. "Nora," he said, his voice low and direct, "if my coming here put your land at risk—" "Don't," she said. "I have to say it." "Then say it and be done with it, because my answer is the same whether you say it or not." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't create Dorothea Holt. You didn't give her that document or the 2 years she spent deciding when to use it. You brought me fabric scraps, and you sat on my fence and you listened. You picked up my quilt out of the dirt on a day when I needed something picked up." She held his eyes. "You are not the cause of this. You're one of the reasons I fought instead of folding." He was quiet for a long moment. "I should have been there," he said, "when you went to Pike." "I had Edna and Reverend Slade," she said. "I didn't need rescuing. I needed documentation." A pause, then quieter, "But I'm glad you're here now." He sat down on the porch step. She sat beside him, close the way they'd started sitting, not quite touching, but near enough that the nearness was a choice. They sat there in the afternoon light, without resolving anything, which was fine because some things weren't ready to be resolved. She'd learned that from quilting. Some seams needed to rest before you pressed them flat, or they puckered and pulled and told on themselves. The following week, the sewing circle voted. Helen Pruitt came to Nora's door that evening with the expression of a woman who had been in a room where something bad happened and had only just worked up the will to say so directly. She came in, sat at the kitchen table, and put both hands around the cup Nora poured for her before she said a word. "Dorothea called an emergency meeting," Helen said. "She put it to a vote, whether to formally request that you stop attending circle." Nora held her own cup and said nothing. "5 in favor," Helen said. 2 against. "Who voted against?" Nora asked. Helen looked at her. "Edna and me." Nora set her cup down carefully. "You voted against it," she said. "I did." Helen's voice was thin, but it held. "And I told Dorothea that a sewing circle that votes people out isn't a sewing circle. It's a committee. And I had no interest in being on that kind of committee." She paused. "She told me I was being hysterical." "Are you still in the circle?" "I told her I'd think about it." Helen's jaw shifted. "Which means no, but I haven't said so yet because I wanted to tell you first." Nora looked at her. Helen Pruitt, who had been standing slightly behind Dorothea Holt for as long as Nora had been aware of either of them, was sitting at her kitchen table on a weeknight telling her about a vote she'd lost on Nora's behalf. "Helen," she said. "Don't tell me it's all right," Helen said with a force that surprised them both. "Because it is not all right, and I am tired of pretending it is. Dorothea Holt has been running this town's women like a foreman runs a crew for 15 years, and I have gone along with it because it was easier, and I am done with that." She stopped. Her chest moved once. Nora looked at her. "I wasn't going to tell you it's all right," she said. "I was going to say thank you." Helen pressed her mouth together. Her eyes went bright in a way she didn't let break. "You're going to keep making quilts," she said, "regardless of what Dorothea does." "Yes. And Danner is going to keep coming here." Nora held her eyes. "That's his choice to make." "But you want him to?" A pause. "Yes," she said. "I want him to." Helen nodded once, the nod of a woman who has confirmed something she needed to confirm. Then she finished her coffee and went home, and Nora sat alone at her kitchen table for a long time after the sound of her footsteps faded down the road. Reed came by Thursday. He'd been to the feed supply that morning. He hadn't planned to tell her what had happened there. She could see that in the set of his shoulders when he came through the gate. But he sat on the fence rail and was quiet for longer than usual, and she waited, and eventually he told her, Otto Driscoll and 2 others, loud enough to be heard on purpose. The words they'd used, the particular combination of desperate and foolish, and the words that described Nora's size in the language of cruelty rather than fact. Reed had paid for his supplies. He had walked out without saying a word. "What did you do?" she asked. "Finished buying what I came for," he said. "Paid. Left." "Good," she said. "It didn't feel good." "I know." She looked at him. "But losing your temper over Otto Driscoll would have made it worse for me, not better. You handled it right." He sat with that, the tight thing still visible in his jaw. Then, "How long have they been doing that? The way they talk about you?" She thought about how to answer. "Long as I can remember," she said. "I was a large girl from the start. Large and quiet and odd, according to the general consensus. Other children found that useful for about 10 years, and then the adults took over and refined it. She pulled her thread through the work in her lap. You get used to it. You don't get used to it, he said quietly. You get capable of surviving it. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him. He was looking at the land, not at her. She had the sense he'd said something he hadn't entirely planned to say. No, she said after a moment. They're not the same thing. The agreement sat between them solid and slightly fragile. The way honest things often are. The storm came on a Wednesday night. Nora had felt it building since afternoon, the particular pressure change that people who grew up in Colorado learn to read in their bodies before they read it in the sky. She moved things inside, staked the garden, got the chickens settled, and by the time the first hard rain hit the roof, the house was as ready as it was going to be. She was working on the large quilt, the one she'd been building since she began understanding what it was supposed to be when she heard hoofbeats through the sound of the rain. She went to the window. Reed Danner was riding through her gate in the middle of a thunderstorm, his hat brim running water, his jacket dark from the shoulders down. He led his horse to the lean-to beside the house and unsaddled the animal with practiced efficiency. He didn't rush, because rushing in that kind of rain accomplished nothing, and he apparently knew it. She had the door open before he reached the porch. Caught me between Benson and here, he said, stepping under the overhang. Water ran off everything. I didn't want to camp in it. You could have, she said. I could have, he agreed. I came here instead. Simply stated, no angle on it. She'd learned that was how he said the things that meant something. Plainly without ornamentation, the way you set down a solid object on a table rather than waving it around to make sure it's noticed. Come in, she said. He came in. She found her father's old flannel shirt and handed it to him. He took it without making anything of the gesture, went to the far side of the room and changed with the simple practicality of a man who had spent time in shared quarters and understood how to manage privacy without drama. She put the kettle on and did not watch. When she turned back, he was standing at her work table looking at the quilt pieces laid out across its surface. He studied them with the full attention she'd come to rely on in a way she hadn't noticed happening until it was already true. You've gotten further, he said. I've had a clear idea of it for about a week, she replied. Sometimes it goes fast, once you know the shape. He looked at the green wool piece now cut into careful squares and placed near the center of the emerging pattern. He didn't say anything about it. He had given it to her. She had told him what she would do with it. He trusted her to do what she said, and he didn't second-guess things he had already agreed to. She made coffee. He sat. The storm pressed against the house in rhythmic waves, and the lamp made everything close and amber-lit. And it was the first time he had been inside her house, actually inside, not standing at the door or on the porch, and the space accommodated him with a naturalness she hadn't anticipated. She brought the coffee and sat across from him at the table. Tell me about her, she said. He looked up. Your wife, she said. I've been holding pieces of her things for weeks. I think I should know something about her. A long pause. The rain continued steady on the roof above them. Her name was May, he said. Nora held the name for a moment. Was she from Montana? From Illinois. We went to Montana together. He looked at his cup. I was 28, she was 23. We had about 4 years. He thought about that with the seriousness it deserved. Good years, hard sometimes. We moved a lot. She never complained about the moving. I think she wanted to sometimes. I think she was tired of it, but she didn't say so. His jaw tightened slightly. I wish she had. I wish she'd told me to stop. Would you have? Nora asked. I don't know, he said honestly. I'd like to think so. She wrapped both hands around her cup. What was she like? Calm, he said without hesitation. Even when things weren't calm, she was calm in a way that didn't shut things out. She felt things she was as real as anyone I've known, but she had this quality of knowing which things deserved her full response and which things didn't. She didn't waste it. Nora was quiet. Something about that description arrived in her in a complicated way. She felt its truth, felt she could almost see May from it, but she also felt the particular tenderness of hearing a man describe a woman he had loved with that much precision in the past tense. "She sounds like someone I'd have liked," Nora said. "I think she'd have liked you," he said, and he said it in the voice he used for things that were simply true. "How did she die?" "Fever," he said. "Fast. 3 days from first sick to gone." He paused. His hands held the cup without tension, which was how she'd started reading his emotion, not in what his face did, but in how his hands went when he was being moved and trying not to show it. "There was nothing to do. I had a doctor there within a day, but—" He stopped. "There was nothing to do." "What did you do after?" she asked. "Rode," he said. "Found the cattle work. Went back and forth. Didn't stop anywhere long enough for it to become a home." He finally looked up at her. "I told you that already." "You told me the shape of it," she said. "I wanted the inside." His eyes stayed on hers for a moment that had weight. "The inside," he said quietly, "is that I got good at not needing anything, at not having anything I couldn't pack in a saddlebag. I kept the cloth pieces because I couldn't figure out how to let them go, and I couldn't figure out how to keep them, so I just kept them moving with me. Until I came here. Until I gave them to you." "Why did you give them to me?" she asked. "The pieces of her things." He looked at his hands. "Because I watched you hold that first piece, and I knew you'd let it be what it was. Not in the ground and not in a box. Somewhere that held it the right way." He looked up. "I knew you'd put it somewhere it meant something." Something in her chest opened the way a closed thing opens, not broken, just finally wide enough. "I will," she said. "I'll put them somewhere they hold." He looked at her. And for a moment, just a moment, the tightness he carried went completely, and he looked like a man who had put down something very heavy he had been carrying for a very long distance. The storm talked for them for a while after that, which was enough. Later, Nora looked at the quilt pieces spread across the table. She looked at the green wool squares near the center. She looked at the burgundy still waiting to find its place in the overall structure. She looked at the indigo. "I'm going to put May in the middle," she said. "The green wool. It'll be the center anchor. Everything else builds out from it." He said nothing for a long moment. "Is that all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "That's more than all right." In the morning he was up before her. She came out to find the blankets folded neatly near the hearth, her coffee already made, and Reed standing at her work table looking at the quilt pieces she'd left spread out the night before. "You moved the burgundy," he said when he heard her. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Figured something out." She came to stand beside him and look at what she'd done in the dark hours before dawn. She had moved the burgundy, the pieces from her mother's Sunday dress, to form a ring between the green wool center and the outer indigo border. It changed the whole balance of the piece. The colors now spoke to each other in a way they hadn't when she'd started. "The burgundy is your mother," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "She belongs between the center and the outside. She always was. She was the one who made everything in the middle feel safe and everything outside feel possible." She paused. "I didn't know that until last night. I've been making this quilt for weeks, and I didn't understand what the burgundy was doing until the middle of a thunderstorm." He looked at the arrangement for a long time. "Who's the indigo?" he asked. She glanced at him. "That's me." He looked at the indigo pieces, deep and various, cut from different weights of fabric, but all in the same family of blue, ringing the whole exterior of the pattern. "The outside," he said. "The part that holds the shape," she said. "The border. It looks like the edge, but it's actually the structure. Without it, everything else loses its form." He looked at the pieces for another long moment. "That's not how you think of yourself," he said quietly. "The way they treat you in town." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's what's true." She poured herself coffee and stood beside him looking at the emerging pattern. What we tell ourselves about ourselves and what's actually true are two different conversations. Sometimes they take a while to line up. May used to say something like that, he said. That the stories we carry about ourselves are the last things to change even when everything else does. That you have to be patient with the old story while you're building the new one. He paused. She was smarter than me about most things. She sounds it, Nora said. He looked at her sideways, and there was something in it that was almost humor. That's not a disagreement I'd make, he said. She laughed, small and real and unheld. It surprised her. He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his expression opened slightly, the way a door that has been almost latched will release when the right pressure shifts. It was there, and then it wasn't, and he was looking at the quilt again. But she had seen it. He left after breakfast. The storm had gone through and left the air clean and the ground saturated, and the whole world looking like it had been rinsed and set out to dry. "Before you go," she said from the porch, "I should tell you something." He stopped with his hand on the horse's neck and looked back at her. "The social," she said, "the summer church social. It's in 3 weeks, Saturday." She paused. "Dorothea runs the planning committee. She controls who feels welcome and who doesn't without ever having to say a word about it directly. She'll use it to make a point about you," he said, "not a question. She can't touch my deed anymore. Everyone knows the matter at Pike's office is settled, so she'll use the only thing she has left." She held his eyes, "Which is what people see when they look at me." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" The question arrived clean and simple, not what should you do or what are people saying, but what do you want? She'd been asked that question so rarely in her life that she still noticed every time. "I want to go," she said. "I want to take the big quilt when it's finished." She looked at him steadily. "It won't just be mine anymore. It has May in it. It has my grandmother and my mother. It has pieces from people in this town who gave scraps years ago and never knew where they went. If Dorothea wants to make a public point, I'd like to make one too." He was quiet for a moment. "She'll have the room," he said. "She'll have the social and the churchyard and 5 women who voted the way she wanted." "I know," Nora said. "And if it goes badly, it goes badly, but I'll have gone anyway. That matters to me." He looked at her for a long time. "The social is Saturday in 3 weeks, he said. "I'll be finishing the run in Ridgeway by then." He paused. "I'll be back before Saturday." She held that. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I'll be back before Saturday." He rode out. She watched him until the road bent and took him. Then she went inside and picked up her needle and worked. Reed came by again the following week and the one after that, making good on his word about the route and about the fence rail and about the particular quality of silence he brought with him that had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like presence. On one of those afternoons, Winifred Cass knocked at Nora's door. She had not been expected. She came in without being pressed, stood in the front room and looked at the work on the table. Her eyes moved across the pieces. The way eyes moved when a person who knew needlework was actually registering what they saw and couldn't stop themselves. Then she reached into her coat pocket and placed something on the edge of the table, a piece of white cotton the size of her palm folded 4 times, worn at the creases from being folded and unfolded many times over many years. "My daughter," Winifred said. Her name was Iris. She was 3 years and 2 months old when she died. Winter of 1872. Fever. She looked at the fabric, not at Nora. "I cut this from her christening gown afterward. I don't know why. I needed something small enough to hold." She paused. "I've kept it in a box for 11 years, and I don't know what to do with it." Nora looked at the folded white cotton. Eyelet edging still visible on one side. 11 years of careful folding the fabric, memorizing its own creases. "Come back Tuesday," Nora said. "Come here, not the circle. I'll put her in a good place." Winifred looked up. Something moved in her face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but was some combination of both. She nodded. Then before she moved toward the door, she turned back. "The indigo," she said. She looked at the border pieces on the table. "In your first quilt, the one that fell in the street. I said it didn't suit the burgundy." She paused. "I was wrong about that." She let herself out. Nora stood in the middle of her front room for a long time after the sound of her footsteps faded down the path. She looked at the piece of white cotton on the edge of her table. She looked at the quilt spread across its surface, its pattern becoming clearer every day. Then she picked up her needle and went back to work. 2 days before the social read came to tell her about Glenwood. He sat on the fence rail in the late afternoon light and said, "There's a man at the end of my run. Name of Aldrich. He owns a cattle operation outside Glenwood. Good size, been running it 20 years. He offered me a stake in it last year. A real stake, not just work, but a share of the whole enterprise." Nora waited. "I turned him down," Reed said. "At the time it felt like being asked to stop moving, which felt like being asked to stop breathing, but I've been thinking about it since." He looked at her. "About whether I'm ready for a different answer now." She looked at him steadily. "You should find out. I want to finish this run first, get to Ridgeway and back." He paused. "Then I'll need to go to Glenwood, talk to Aldrich." "You should," she said again. He looked at her for a long moment. "When I say I'll be back?" "I know what it means," she said quietly. Something in his face settled. He mounted up. At the gate he stopped and looked back at her on the porch. "I haven't been back anywhere in 3 years," he said. "Not once, not for any reason." He held her eyes. "I'll be back." He rode out. She watched him until the road bent and took him. Then she went inside and picked up the white cotton Winifred had left. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that has lived inside someone's grief for 11 years. She looked at the quilt pattern, near the burgundy ring slightly inside it, close to the things that had held people while they were living, close to the color of Frances Callum's Sunday dress, which had been present for every occasion that mattered. That was where Iris belonged. She placed the white cotton gently on top of the quilt pattern and left it there. Then she picked up her needle and worked until it was too dark to see, and the quilt grew around her in the lamplight, and the shapes within it became clearer with every hour. And when she finally set the needle down, she could see for the first time the whole of what it was going to be. She finished the quilt on a Friday night. The last stitch went in past midnight. The oil lamp had burned low, throwing soft, unsteady light across the kitchen table where the piece was spread in its completed form for the first time. She set the needle down and sat back and looked at it. It was the largest thing she had ever made. Larger than she'd planned when she started, because the pieces had kept asking for more pieces, because once the structure became clear, the additions were inevitable. Maize green wool at the center, cut into careful squares that held their softness, even now, even stitched into a larger thing. Her mother's burgundy and the ring around it, the color of Sunday mornings and biscuits and a woman humming without words. Her grandmother Hattie's black at the very heart, the foundation beneath everything. The indigo border deep and various, holding the shape from the outside in. The yellow calico threading through all of it like light between heavier things. And placed with care in the burgundy ring near the pieces that spoke of holding and protecting Winifred's small square of white eyelet. Iris, 3 years and 2 months. Winter of 1872. It was not a perfect quilt. The borders ran uneven in 3 places. One section of the indigo had been pieced from 5 small scraps because she hadn't had a large enough single piece. There were seams that ran heavy and seams so fine they were barely visible. Some of the color transitions were abrupt up close and resolved into something coherent only when you stepped back. But every single piece of it held to every other piece with a strength that was not accidental and not decorative. Structural, fundamental, the kind of holding that came from the right stitch in the right place, made by hands that understood what they were doing even when the mind was still catching up. She sat with it for a long time in the almost dark. Then she folded it carefully, wrapped it in clean cloth, and went to bed. For the first time in a long while, she did not have to talk herself into sleeping. Saturday arrived with the full insistence of a Colorado summer morning, the kind of day that didn't ask permission before being itself. Nora dressed in her good blouse, the dark blue one she'd mended twice and pressed the night before. She braided her hair the way she usually didn't bother with. She wrapped the quilt under her arm and walked the 3/4 mile into Harrow Falls with the specific intention of a woman who has decided something and is walking toward it without looking back. She heard the summer social before she turned the corner. Voices, children, somewhere a fiddle working through something cheerful. The smell of food carried on warm air. The sound of a community gathering which had the shape of welcoming and had never in her experience been the same thing. She turned the corner and walked through the open gate into the churchyard. Most of Harrow Falls was there in some form. Men in good shirts, women in summer dresses, children underfoot and uncorrectable. Tables set with food along the fence line. Dorothea Holt, near the center table, precise in grey silk, Winifred Cass, and 2 other circle women arranged around her. Dorothea saw Nora the moment she walked through the gate. Nora didn't break stride. She walked to an empty table near the far side of the gathering, set the wrapped quilt down, and began unwrapping it. Edna Birch appeared at her side within 30 seconds. "You're here," she said low. "I'm here," Nora said. Helen Pruitt materialized on her other side a moment later, having apparently been watching for her from across the yard. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, which was exactly right. Nora unfolded the quilt and shook it open carefully, the way you open something that has 11 nights and weeks and 100 small decisions in it, and spread it across the table. The silence that followed the sound of cloth on wood had the quality of something louder. It was the colors first. The deep indigo border immediate and intentional. The burgundy ring inside it warm and particular. The green wool at the center softer than anything else on the table. And threading through all of it, the yellow calico, small white flowers catching the morning light. Then the scale. Then, for those who looked longer, the pieces themselves, the variations in fabric, the way nothing matched, and everything held the seams, running between materials so different they should not have worked together, and yet did. Dorothea was beside her before Nora had finished smoothing the last corner. "Nora," controlled, careful. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I come every year," Nora said pleasantly. "You know that." Dorothea's eyes went to the quilt. "What have you brought?" "A quilt," Nora said, "for people to see if they want to look." Winifred Cass came to stand just behind Dorothea. "This isn't a quilt exhibition." "No," Nora agreed. "It's a community social, which is exactly the right place for it." She turned back to the quilt and made a small adjustment to a corner, simply to have something to do with her hands that wasn't gripping the table edge. Dorothea looked at the quilt. Her face was doing the work of management, holding its arrangement, keeping its expression deliberate. And then her eyes found the burgundy, and something involuntary happened just for a fraction of a second before she got it back. "That color," she said. "My mother's Sunday dress," Nora said. "Frances Callum wore it every Easter for 20 years, every occasion that mattered to her." She paused. "Which was most occasions." Dorothea looked at the burgundy. The yard sounds continued around them. Children, the fiddle, voices carrying on the summer air. And in the middle of all of it, this woman stood and looked at a color she had known on a person she had known for 30 years. "I'm not asking you to like me," Nora said quietly. "I'm not asking you to approve of my work or the choices I make or who comes to my gate. I'm just asking you to look at what I made." Dorothea looked at it. 5 seconds. 10. Her hand at her side moved slightly. And then Dorothea Holt did something no one in that yard had seen her do in 30 years of managing everything and everyone. She reached out and touched the fabric. Just once. Just the edge of the burgundy. Her fingers resting there for a single moment, her face open in a way it was not usually open before she took her hand back and composed herself. But everyone saw it, and no one said a word, because some things are true enough that speaking them aloud would only make them smaller. Before either of them could say anything else, Nora heard the gate open and felt without turning the particular quality of attention the yard gave to whoever had just walked in. She turned. Reed Danner walked across the churchyard toward her. He had turned back from Ridgeway 2 days early. He had not explained this to anyone because it didn't require explanation. He moved with the same unhurried directness that drew the eye precisely because it didn't announce itself, simply arrived. He crossed the yard without looking at anyone specific and came to stand beside Nora at the table. He looked at the quilt for a moment, then he looked at her. "It's finished," he said. "Last night," she said. He nodded once. He looked at the quilt again, and she watched him find the green wool center the way she'd known he would without needing it, pointed out the way you find the thing that matters in a room. His jaw held itself steady in the way that meant something. Dorothea looked at him. "Mr. Danner." Her voice had lost its performance. What was underneath was cooler, harder. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending our social." "Community social," he said. He touched his hat brim. "I'm part of the community passing through." "You've been passing through for some weeks," Dorothea said. "Harrow Falls grows on you," he said evenly. Dorothea's jaw tightened. "Mr. Danner, your continued presence here has been a source of considerable concern. There were questions raised about Miss Callum's property." "I heard about those questions," Reed said. Not cold, not aggressive. Factual, the way he was factual about most things. "I also heard they had straightforward answers, because this woman walked into the land agent's office with the original document, a witness statement, and a reverend willing to stand behind his own signature." He paused. The concern might have been better directed at the questions than at the woman they were aimed at. The yard had gone completely quiet. The fiddle had stopped. Nora gave Reed the smallest shake of her head. Not because she didn't appreciate it, but because this wasn't the moment she needed from him. He understood immediately. He stepped back half a step, not away, just aside, and let her have the space. She turned back to Dorothea. "I've been coming to this town for 24 years, Nora said. Her voice was clear, and she was proud of that. "I've been coming to this social for 8. I've sat in your circle, and I've mended this town's clothes, and I've walked this street without apology for as long as I've been walking it." She paused. "I know you've had opinions about all of it. I know you've had opinions about what I look like and how I live and who comes to my gate." She held Dorothea's eyes. "I'm not asking you to change those opinions. I'm asking you to look at this quilt, at what it is and what it holds." Dorothea looked at it for a long count, a real one, unhurried. The burgundy, the center. Her face did something she had not planned for it to do. Before she could speak, Ida Purcell, a rancher's wife from the north end of the county who had never been part of Dorothea's circle, pushed forward slightly from the edge of the gathering. She reached toward the yellow calico and then stopped herself. "May I?" "You may," Nora said. Ida touched the yellow calico carefully. "My grandmother had a dress in this pattern. Small white flowers on yellow ground. I haven't seen it in 30 years. It came from a ranch outside Glenwood," Nora said. "Someone carried it a long way and thought it deserved a home." Ida looked at Reed. Reed nodded once, small. Ida looked back at the quilt and didn't move away. Then another woman pulled a chair to the table and sat down and just looked at the quilt. Then a man Nora recognized as a rancher whose wife had given her mending work 2 years running came to stand beside it with his hands in his pockets. Then someone else. Then someone else. Winifred Cass had not moved. She was looking at the white eyelet square placed near the burgundy ring. Her face had come undone from its usual arrangement, not dramatically, but in the way that faces come undone when something has been true for a long time and is finally being acknowledged in daylight. "Who is in the white?" she said quietly to no one in particular. "Iris," Reed said from where he stood. He said it simply. 3 years old, from someone who loved her and didn't know where to put that love after. Winifred looked at him, then at the quilt, then at Nora. And for the first time in all the years Nora had been coming to this town, Winifred Cass looked at her without an agenda arranged behind her eyes. Dorothea left before the social ended. She collected her things, said something brief to the 2 women nearest her, and walked out through the gate with her chin level and her pace controlled. She didn't make a scene. Dorothea Holt had never made scenes. She managed exits the way she managed everything, but she had touched the burgundy, and everyone in that yard had seen it. Otto Driscoll was near the gate when Nora and Reed moved to leave in the long evening light. He'd been at the edge of the gathering for most of the afternoon, not quite a part of it, not quite removed from it. He had the expression of a man who has been thinking about something long enough that it has become physically uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. "Miss Callum." She stopped. He looked at his hat brim rather than at her. "That day you fell outside Henderson's. Me and the others. The things we said." He shifted his weight. "I've been thinking about that for a while. It was wrong. What we said. I know that." Nora looked at him. He was still not quite looking back, which was the most honest part of the whole thing. A man who looks at you directly when he apologizes is sometimes performing it. Otto Driscoll, staring at his hat brim, was a man who was actually sorry and didn't know how to hold it comfortably. "All right, Otto," she said. "You said it. I heard it." He looked up briefly, surprised, like a man who had braced himself for more resistance. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked his horse out of the yard. Reed watched him go. "People surprise you sometimes," he said. "They do," Nora agreed. "That's worth remembering." They walked out of the churchyard together in the evening light, and people saw them go, and this time the seeing was not a verdict. It was just a fact. A man and a woman walking in the same direction. It was enough to be a fact. Winifred came on Tuesday with her husband George, a quiet man who worked the mill, and who had the particular stillness of a person who had spent 11 years not talking about something and had made that silence into a condition he'd stopped questioning. He stood in front of the quilt, spread across Nora's table, and he looked at the white eyelet square near the burgundy ring, and Winifred stood beside him, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. Then George Cass reached out and touched the edge of the white fabric very lightly with one finger, and his face did something private, and Nora looked away from it because it wasn't hers to witness directly. "Where will it go?" he asked. His voice was rougher than she expected, like a voice that hadn't been used for certain kinds of words in a long time. "I'm going to hang it in the church hall," Nora said. "On the wall, where anyone walking by can see it." He nodded slowly. He and Winifred stood there for a long time. When they left, they went out through the gate together, and George held it open for his wife, and she passed through, and he latched it behind them both. Nora stood on her porch and watched them walk down the road, two people moving in the same direction after 11 years of moving around each other. 3 days after the social, Dorothea Holt came to Nora's gate alone. No Winifred. No one else. Just Dorothea, in her good dress, holding nothing with the expression of a woman who has rehearsed something and is now standing at the place where rehearsal ends and the actual thing begins. Nora came off the porch and opened the gate. "Come in." Dorothea came through. She stood in the yard and looked at the first quilt, the small one still hanging on the fence line, the log cabin pattern with the dirt mark across its center that had never entirely washed out. She looked at it for a long time. "The burgundy," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "I knew Frances Callum for 30 years, Dorothea said. She was still looking at the fence, not at Nora. "She was a better woman than I've been. She was kind to people who weren't easy to be kind to. She never managed anyone." Her voice had been stripped of its usual finish down to something older, something that remembered. She just saw people, as they were. Nora waited. "I went to Clifford Pike with that document," Dorothea said. "I want you to know I knew the repayment had been made. I'd seen the original 2 years ago when certain papers passed through my hands that shouldn't have. I chose the copy deliberately." She turned and looked at Nora directly. "I want to say that plainly. Not because you don't know it already, because I need to say it without dressing it up." The yard was quiet around them. A bird somewhere in the cottonwood. The sound of wind in the fence quilt's fabric. "Why are you saying it now?" Nora asked. Not unkindly, just directly. "Because Edna Birch told me 2 weeks ago that I'd become the kind of person Frances Callum would have been ashamed of," Dorothea said. "And she was right. And I would rather hear it from someone else and do something about it than hear it from my own conscience when it's too late to change anything." She paused. "I've been a large person in a small town for a long time. When something doesn't fit what I've built, I manage it. That's the word I use to myself. I manage situations. What I did to you was not management. It was something smaller and less honest than that." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down, Dorothea," she said. Dorothea sat on the porch step, not the chair, the step. Nora sat beside her, and they looked out at the fence quilt together. "I'm not going to tell you it was all right," Nora said, "because it wasn't, the document especially." "I know. And I'm not going to tell you we're friends," Nora said, "because we're not, and pretending would be an insult to both of us." "I know that too," Dorothea said. "But," Nora said, and paused to find the right words. "My mother used to say that a town is only as decent as what it does with the people who don't fit its picture. And I think you're capable of being part of something more decent than what you've been running." She looked at her. "That's not forgiveness. That's just what I believe is true." Dorothea was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her coat and took out a small piece of fabric. Blue chambray, worn soft from years of being held and put away and taken out again. "My son Robert," she said. "He left Harrow Falls 12 years ago. We didn't part well. He's in California." She looked at the fabric. "We've started writing to each other again. 4 letters now. He says he might come home in the spring." Her voice caught on the last word barely but enough. "This is from a shirt he left behind when he went. I've kept it all this time." Nora looked at the chambray, blue like early morning soft from 12 years of being held. "Robert belongs near the center," she said, "near the pieces of people who found their way back to something." Dorothea held out the fabric. Her hand was not quite steady. Nora took it carefully with the full attention the piece deserved. "Thank you, Nora," Dorothea said. It was the first time in 24 years that Dorothea Holt had used her name without an angle in it. She hung the completed quilt in the church hall on a Saturday morning. Edna Birch held the ladder. Helen Pruitt handed up the nails one at a time. Ida Purcell stood back and called out corrections to the angle until it was right. It took the better part of 3 hours. When they stepped back and looked at it on the wall, the hall was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something arrives that has real weight. May's green wool at the center. Francis Callum's burgundy in its ring. Hattie's black beneath everything, the thing the whole structure was built from. Iris's white eyelet placed with care inside the warmth of the burgundy, near the pieces that had protected and held. Robert's chambray blue close to the things that had found their way home. The indigo border deep and structural, holding the entire shape together from the outside. And the yellow calico threading through all of it like light finding the spaces between heavier things. Ida said, "It looks like the town." "It is the town," Nora said. "The parts of it worth keeping." Edna reached out and touched the indigo border lightly, not the center, the edge. She looked at Nora. "You're in the border," she said. "I always was," Nora said. "I just didn't always know it." The letter came on a Wednesday, 18 days after Reed had ridden out toward Ridgeway and then on to Glenwood. She recognized his handwriting before she fully read it. Direct. No flourish, the handwriting of a man who had decided long ago that ornamentation was a form of hiding. The letter said, "Aldrich is gone to Oregon. The operation sold." I stood in Glenwood for 2 days. I waited for the feeling that always comes, the one that says, "Keep moving. Find the next route. Don't stop." It didn't come. What came instead was the knowledge of where I wanted to be. I have a question I would rather ask in person than in a letter. "I'll be there Saturday." She read it twice. Set it on the table beside the lamp. Picked up her needle. She worked 3 hours, then set the needle down and allowed herself to feel what she felt. Not happiness. Exactly, happiness was too simple and too brief for it, but something more structural and more durable. Something load-bearing. The feeling of a thing that has been held in tension for a long time finally settling into its final position and holding. He came back on Saturday. She heard his horse from inside and was on the porch when he came through the gate. He latched it, walked up the path, stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, direct and unhurried, like something simply real that deserved to be looked at honestly. He didn't sit down. "I went to Glenwood," he said. "I stood in that place. Aldrich is gone, the operation is sold, the plan I had is finished." He paused. "I stood there and waited for the thing that always comes. The feeling that says move on. Find the next route. Keep going." He looked at her. It didn't come. She held very still. "What came instead was this," he said. "Here. You. The gate and the fence and that quilt on the wall of the church hall that has May in it and your mother and a little girl named Iris who deserved to be somewhere she'd last." He stopped. "What came instead was the understanding that I've been a man with no direction for 3 years, and now I have one, and it goes through your gate." He looked at her steadily. "The question I wanted to ask in person is whether you want that, whether you want me to stay. Not passing through, not a cattle run. Staying." She came down off the porch step. She stopped in front of him close enough to see the travel dust on his jacket and the careful mending in his sleeve where he'd repaired it himself with stitches that were competent and completely without artistry. And she looked at him. "Reed Danner," she said, and the weight of his full name surprised them both. "I have been putting the broken and the beloved pieces of this town into a structure that holds. I have been fighting for my land and standing in rooms where I was not wanted and refusing to make myself smaller so other people could be more comfortable." She held his eyes. "I have been in every way a person can be, waiting for something worth staying for on my own terms, and not just because leaving was harder. And you are worth staying for." He looked at her for a long, real moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Both of his hands around hers, steady and certain and warm, the way he held things that mattered with attention and without performance. "I'm not easy," he said. "I've been running long enough that I'll have moments of wanting to run even when I know better. And I'm not small," she said, "in any sense. I'll push back when I think you're wrong. I will not apologize for taking up the space I take." "Good," he said. "I don't want you smaller. I want you exactly as you are." She felt that arrive in every part of her that had ever been told it was too much. "Then stay," she said, "and when you feel like running, tell me. We'll figure it out together." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "May would have told you to stop being an idiot about this considerably earlier." He laughed, real and unheld, the laugh of a man who has stopped managing what his face does. "Approximately a year and a half ago," he agreed. He was still holding her hands. "She'd have liked you," he said. "She really would have." "I know," Nora said. "I can tell from her fabric." The autumn came on gradually, the way Colorado autumns did, not dramatically, but with accumulation. The mornings grew sharper. The light changed its angle. The cottonwoods along the creek went gold in a way that looked deliberate. Reed built a second fence line on the south side of the property through October. He did it the way he did most things, directly, without announcing it, as though it was simply a task that needed doing, and he was the person present to do it. He hired a younger man from town to help and trained him with patience and without wasted words. Helen Pruitt's new sewing circle met on Wednesday afternoons at her house. No rules about whose work was good enough or whose colors matched. Nora was the first person Helen had invited. Edna Birch was the second. By November, the circle had 9 members, which was more than Dorothea Holtz had ever had, at its peak a fact that nobody mentioned out loud but that everyone was aware of. Reverend Slade gave 3 more sermons through the fall about what broken pieces build when they're placed in good company. The congregation was attentive in a way it hadn't been for years. Dorothea sat in the 3rd pew and listened without the expression of a woman composing her response. Winifred and George Cass came to the church hall together on a Sunday in November and stood in front of the quilt for half an hour. They held hands the entire time, a thing they had apparently stopped doing so long ago that when they started again, it surprised them both. When they left, they were talking in the way of two people who have found that a door they thought was permanently closed had simply been stuck, and that applying the right kind of pressure at the right moment had been enough to open it. A letter arrived for Dorothea from California in early December. Robert had purchased his train ticket. He would arrive in April. She came to Nora's gate 3 days after receiving it, not to say anything particular, but to stand in the yard and look at the first quilt still hanging on the fence, and Nora brought 2 cups of coffee, and they stood there together in the December cold and didn't say very much, which was its own kind of progress between 2 women who had spent 24 years not knowing how to be in the same room without one of them managing the other. Edna told Nora in January that Pike had quietly transferred a parcel he'd been holding near her south boundary back into proper county registry, rather than continue to have his name associated with anything related to the Callum property. Nobody made a formal announcement. Nobody needed to. On a Sunday afternoon in late January, Nora and Reed walked to the church hall together to see the quilt. It was hanging where she'd put it on the wide wall, May at its center. Everything else arranged around that stillness. Other people had been there before them that day. There often were. Someone had left a small bunch of dried wildflowers on the floor beneath it, which nobody had moved. Reed stood beside her and looked at it. "It's different from the inside," he said. "What do you mean?" "When you're in it," he said. "When your piece is there." He looked at the green wool center, soft and precise, and holding its position without effort. "It feels smaller than I expected. Not in a bad way. Just the right size. Like it belongs to the right scale of thing." Nora looked at May's green wool. At the whole of it, the center that held the rings that protected and connected the border, that gave everything its shape. She would have called this excessive, Reed said. There was warmth in it. The warmth of someone who knew their person well enough to know exactly what they would have said. "Probably," Nora agreed. "But she would have been wrong." "Probably," he agreed. They stood there in the quiet of the hall, the January light coming through the narrow windows at a low angle, making the colors do something complicated and beautiful that Nora hadn't planned and couldn't have planned and wouldn't change for anything. On the walk home at the gate, he held it open for her. She walked through. He came through after and latched it behind them, the small, clean sound of metal catching on metal, certain and complete. The first quilt moved in the January wind on the fence. The indigo and the burgundy and the dark center square that had never moved, that had been the thing everything else was built from the beginning. She looked at it from the porch. 11 nights. 37 weeks since then. Every piece that had come to her from somewhere else and been given a place. Every seam that had held when it needed to hold. Reed came to stand beside her. "It stays on the fence," he said. "Not a question." "It stays on the fence," she said. "People need to see things that hold." He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. The look of a man who has finally found the direction he was always heading toward and is standing in it and knows it and is not afraid of it. "Yes," he said. "They do." She had been the border all along, the structure that kept everything else from losing its shape. She knew that now. Not as an argument she made to herself, but as a simple fact. The way a finished seam is a fact. The way a latched gate is a fact. The way a quilt spread across a wall holds every person whose life is stitched into it and does not let a single one of them go.